1 year ago, football legend Andrea Pirlo was just beginning his UEFA Pro License course at Italy's famed coaching school, Coverciano. Now, 1 year later, he's getting an education on football's biggest stage from the likes of Barcelona and Messi.
That just about sums up Juve's night, because Barcelona have won in Turin for the first time at the sixth attempt. A shake of the head from Dybala sums up a frustrating evening.
Juventus is what we want to talk about first, because things are not going well for the old lady in Turin. The Andrea Pirlo experiment, if we can call it that.
While it's early on in the season and in his coaching career, skeptics are already doubting the hire of Pirlo.
It's absolutely ludicrous when you really think about it. It is absurd. I remember the announcement of Pirlo, they said maybe he can be like Zidane or Pep Guardiola. So that's one complete tactical aberration. He's regarded as one of the greatest managers of all time. And the Real Madrid manager, who has won loads of Champions League, sometimes through luck and sometimes through goodness, and it's only just now being regarded as tactically astute. Right? I have no idea what Juventus is trying to do. It's like they don't do improv. No one's.
He's got the DNA though, Carl. You've forgotten to fact.
Well, DNA is ruining football. Isn't it? All these massive clubs have just been managed by people who get the club, who've got the DNA. It's like it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean.
But as Duncan Alexander points out, it's not just Pirlo. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Mikel Arteta, and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer all signed by big clubs despite having limited prior success or experience. Today, we ask, do elite players make elite managers?
I think elite players can make elite managers, and I think that a lot of the skill sets and understanding of football and ability to work within a dressing room, they are natural translations for an elite player into an elite manager.
Alex Stewart is a senior content strategist for The Athletic and covers tactics for Tifo football.
I think a more interesting question really is around why do elite players seem to get these opportunities perhaps a little more easily than regular players?
Are we seeing more elite players go straight into coaching than before, or does it only kind of appear that way?
I think more elite players are probably getting more high-profile jobs quickly. And you've listed some in the talking points for this, but obviously Zinedine Zidane, Andrea Pirlo, Frank Lampard, Solskjaer, if you call him an elite player. But I think there's a degree to which certain clubs, particularly bigger clubs, are seeing refuge in the idea of bringing in somebody who, in some kind of tangible way, understands the fabric of the club, has played there, has a connection with it. And obviously certain elite players, because they often are at these big clubs, they're in more of a position to make that transition quickly because they've already been at those clubs. Whereas a more workmanlike player, shall we say, is potentially, not in the conversation straight away, not because of their coaching abilities, their managerial abilities, but because they don't have that relationship with a Juventus or a Real Madrid to be able to make that leap.
Is there anything in particular that's kind of driving these big clubs to sign these guys in the modern game? Is there something about the modern game that's driving this?
I think the modern game increasingly has two factors that are at play. The first is finance. So as financial disparity grows, I think elite clubs are in a position where they feel that through the acquisition of certain players, automatically, certainly at a domestic level, they can dominate. That's not to say that they don't need to have a good coach, but it's a lot easier for a Juventus or a Real Madrid to be able to dominate their domestic league if their coach is reasonable and particularly is a good man manager, because they can assemble such a high level of talent within the squad. So I think that's the first point. The second one I'd say is that football increasingly has a sort of cloud of perception around it, of narrative around it, and that clubs are probably cognizant of their I suppose their status almost as a marketing entity. There is something really rich about Andrea Pirlo taking over at Juventus, about Chelsea hiring Frank Lampard. There's something that they can talk about. There's something that they can look to. A lot of these elite players are relatively younger as well. I mean, Zidane obviously now is a little bit older, but they have the kind of bloom of youth about them still. We can remember their playing career. It's very straightforward to go into the archives and find Andrea Pirlo pinging around beautiful passes for Juventus. So it evokes something in not necessarily the hardcore fandom of that club, but as clubs increasingly look to market themselves outside of their home area, Turin if you're Juventus, or, the Southwest London if you're Chelsea, it's nice for fans who are perhaps fans in China or India or something to have that connection, to be able to see that there's a continuity there. So yeah, I think it's two things. I think it's financial disparity, and I think it's often a marketing ploy. That sounds really cynical, doesn't it? But I think that's often true, and certainly one of the guys I know will come on to talk about, Steven Gerrard, I think is sort of out of that for the reason that he's at Rangers rather than Liverpool, which I think makes it an interesting case.
Yeah, you talk about marketing. Another word for that is branding. And it seems like what you're kind of saying is that, if these big clubs want to have a strong brand, a guy like Graham Potter might not be the best guy for that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Look at how Liverpool have leveraged Jurgen Klopp. He's personable, he's affable, he's charismatic. He was never an elite player, but he's absolutely an elite coach. And they have turned him into part of, not necessarily Liverpool's marketing angle, like you say, but definitely Liverpool's brand. And I think that, as clubs are increasingly conscious, particularly clubs where, the more elite you are as a club, the more your head's above the parapet, and if you're Juventus, obviously there's a big captive audience in Italy, and Juventus is the most supported club in Italy by a long, long way. But if you're trying to reach out beyond that, and you're trying to sell a kind of nice, happy story, and not have that idea that certain domestic clubs can dominate on the basis of wealth or on the basis of favoritism or whatever it is, and I'm not saying that particularly for Juventus, just as a broader point, you want to be able to have a brand that is positive and upbeat, and there is something about, I think, attracting a younger, former elite player with a strong association with the club that helps selling that makes that brand stronger.
You said before man management, and it also seems to me like the modern game, it's more important for the manager to be a man manager than maybe before, where you have physios and tactical analysts and data scientists and all sorts of people at the club that can provide their expertise. But really, his job is to get in touch with the players and build that emotional connection that before, when there was only the manager and the assistant, maybe they had to do kind of a whole lot more and had to have wider expertise.
Yeah, I think to a degree that's true. I mean, one of the most tactically sophisticated current coaches, Julian Nagelsmann, albeit got quite roundly beaten by Manchester United, but by and large, I think we can say that with some surety. He has famously said that management is 30% tactics and coaching and 70% social competence, which I think is a really interesting phrase, albeit probably translated from German. That idea of being able to deal with, and I think this is why it particularly applies to elite clubs, where I would never want to say that footballers have a kind of mercenary quality to them. I don't mean in the sense that they're obsessed by money, but in the sense that they are guns for hire. But that is kind of true. And the bigger the club, if you're thinking about a Real Madrid or a PSG, the more that probably applies. It's maybe harder to foster a team spirit. There's more of an expectation of immediate success. And of course, there's a difficulty in dealing with a lack of immediate success. And I guess for a lot of these clubs, that's more about European competition than it is domestic. I think as well that at clubs where the playing squad is genuinely elite, it's quite often difficult to convince the players that the manager is the person to take them forwards if the manager doesn't have some degree of credibility. Now, that credibility may have been garnered as a manager through winning lots of titles, but I don't think there's any doubt that playing ability absolutely helps.
I want to kind of look on the flip side. We mentioned some of the benefits of it, but hiring inexperienced managers seems on the surface like an especially risky bet in the Premier League, where we have maybe collectively the best group of managers in the history of football, you could argue. What do you think about that?
Is it a risk? Yes, it's a risk, but it's much less of a risk if you're a Chelsea or a Manchester United. Because generally speaking, I guess your assessment for success is probably several-fold. European competition, obviously, Champions League being the pinnacle, domestic competition, and then financial security / making a profit. And because of these particularly big teams having a particular financial clout and there being a disparity even within the top flight of English football, for example, there's a significant financial disparity between what Burnley can spend and what Chelsea can spend, then putting in an inexperienced manager like that, yes, it's a risk in terms of what you might not win, but it's definitely not a risk in terms of what you might lose, because Chelsea have enough quality in that squad that relegation is never really going to be a serious issue. So, in terms of making a profit, in terms of sustainability in the Premier League, it's very, very hard to argue that putting in Frank Lampard there is a risk. It is a risk in terms of the opportunity cost of potentially not winning something. And, when Chelsea have had short-term appointees, whether it's Ancelotti or Gus Hiddink or something, they've generally gone on to win something within the season that they're there. So you can kind of parachute in a big name who is older, more experienced, with a relative guarantee of winning something. I mean, the league is a lot more competitive now, arguably. But I think if you're willing to give someone like Frank Lampard an opportunity to develop themselves with a squad, you're prepared to back them financially, there may be a payoff in 2 or 3 seasons and Chelsea win the league. At the very worst, you're probably not going to hurt your bottom line and you're going to generate a good brand narrative and you're still going to do well enough domestically to be able to qualify for a European competition.
If we zoom out a little bit, how have elite managers fared in recent years? I think to me it kind of seems like a mixed bag, but what do you think?
It's definitely a mixed bag. I mean, so you've got someone like Thierry Henry, who is absolutely an elite player, or was an elite player. His managerial career so far, at Monaco, 0.95 points per game in 20 games, Montreal Impact, 1 point per game over 25 games. That's not great, is it? There's instances like Patrick Vieira, who was actually relatively successful with New York City FC, sort of managed them for quite a long period, 90 games, over 1.5 points per game, but Nice not quite working out, possibly. I think what's interesting with some of these guys, like Vieira, for example, served quite a lengthy apprenticeship as the sort of academy director at Manchester City and then manager of their reserves team. So he's somebody who I think has approached it in a much more grounded way, which is to say, earn the reputation and learn the mechanics of management in a slightly less stressful environment. So, there's that. I think you can look at other instances. Someone like Clarence Seedorf, for example, actually started really well at Milan, but didn't last beyond, I think, about 8 or 9 months. Since then, it's kind of spiraled for him. It hasn't worked out. And then the other extreme, and I think what's interesting about this is these are guys who are a little bit older, maybe a little bit more street savvy, possibly. People like Diego Simeone, Didier Deschamps, they absolutely have succeeded as managers. they have been grafting at this for a little bit longer. And I think the managers that we'll see be successful over the next 10 or 15 years who were good to great players are ones who've maybe taken a role as an assistant, or that didn't work out for Thierry Henry at Belgium, sure, but maybe actually a role like Vieira had at Man City is more helpful. So you're managing a reserve side, and I think there's a pathway that allows elite players to develop the skills that are required for elite management that they don't necessarily have already. And the ones who are doing better, I think, are the ones who've done that.
You mentioned that Steven Gerrard was kind of the interesting case study. Obviously, he's kind of done maybe the best of both worlds in that he is up at Rangers, where there is still a lot of pressure, but clearly a big club with a lot of inequality. What do you make of that decision? You said it was an interesting case study.
Yeah, so Gerrard spent time as a coach at Liverpool, and I think got some experience there, which has served him well. The reason that Rangers is an interesting study, exactly like you say, it's absolutely not a high-pressured job. That's a terrible sentence, my apologies. Being one of the duopoly in Scotland in the Premiership there is a massive responsibility. But it's not the responsibility that he would have if he went to Liverpool. And I think one of the interesting things about some of these guys is, and again, you can make a distinction here between Lampard and Solskjaer and Pirlo on the one hand and people like Vieira on the other, is there are some of these guys who are going back to the clubs where they were brilliant players. And there are some of these guys who are taking jobs that are available, that make sense, but they aren't necessarily there. So Vieira didn't go straight to try and manage Arsenal. Omri didn't go to Arsenal. Gattuso did, I think, spend some time at Milan, but, it's more sensible, I think, to remove yourself a little bit from the limelight of managing the club with which you are so strongly associated, because that's when people look at it in a particularly intrusive way. So what Gerrard's done, I think, is incredibly canny. He's spent time in the fabric of the club where he was a very successful player. He's then gone and got a job which is high profile, stressful, demanding, but still with a certain degree of likelihood that he'll do okay just because of the disparities that exist. I actually think he's doing really, really well there, particularly as a defensive coach. Gerrard's performance with Rangers this season is not big on the basis of luck or because Rangers have lots of money. They are a really well-coached side. But at the same time, it's going to make it easier for him to transition if he does end up at Liverpool, for example, because he's cut his teeth away from that immediate pressure that comes with the association of going straight to the club where you made your name.
To a degree, and maybe this is a poor example, but it almost sounds like you're talking about like nepotism, where if you go back to the club that, made you as a player, people don't really necessarily respect your coaching credentials as much as someone like here, giving this an example as Steven Gerrard.
Yeah, I think, this is what I was referring to right at the beginning with the first answer. The question of do elite players make elite managers is a really interesting one, and there are reasons for and against that. But I think the broader question is, why do certain players find it so easy to transition into huge jobs? And yeah, nepotism, maybe. In the instance of Frank Lampard, he has openly admitted that Harry Redknapp was pretty instrumental in him getting the job at Derby to start off with, where I don't think he was massively impressive either. And this is not a hate on Frank Lampard session, but, he happens to be a particularly strong example of a number of the things that we're discussing. It does stick in the craw slightly that there are talented managers and coaches out there who don't necessarily get the opportunity to manage at these big clubs when somebody like a Lampard or a Pirlo with considerably less experience and externally less credibility kind of glides in. And I do think that's one other point I want to make quickly is, you referred to external criticism. And I think, journalists, because of the proliferation of podcasts and so on, channels like Tifo as well, what managers do and how they do it is increasingly under the microscope. I think journalists feel emboldened to talk about tactics because there is a greater degree of understanding of tactics than there was, 10 or 15 years ago, in part because of the work of people like Jonathan Wilson and Michael Cox. And it is easier to look at a game and say, because of that level of understanding, to say, I don't understand what this manager is doing. I don't understand why this team is so bad at transition or so incapable of organising a press, because these are concepts now that are relatively well understood and clear to a lot of the people who are not only writing this material but also consuming it. And so whereas before a manager may have been able to go in and have those technical, tactical deficiencies not really kind of gone over, the media landscape has very much changed, the fan landscape has very much changed, and it's a lot harder to get away with that now. And I think that does make a big, big difference. It's something I think Frank Lampard is, that's what he was referring to when he said he was treated differently as the only English manager in the top six. I don't think that's why he's treated differently. It's certainly not because he's English, but there is now a much more critical, in the sense of based in understanding rather than in the sense of being negative, approach to writing about how football works on the pitch. And obviously managers have the ultimate responsibility for how their team lines up and how they try and play.
So kind of reading between the lines of what you just said, it seems like, to a degree, looking forward to the future, despite these big names or these elite players getting these jobs at these elite clubs, even though it might be easier to get in the door, they will still have just as much, if not maybe even more pressure down the line because fans are more informed, journalists are more informed than ever before. And so, they can't necessarily get away with inexperience like they might have in the past.
I think that's probably true. And I think you can see that from, looking at the way that certain managers like Solskjaer and Lampard are discussed online and discussed in podcasts. There have always been elite players that made this transition. I mean, people forget how good and important a player Jupp Heynckes was, for example. So this is not a new phenomenon. I think that the idea of parachuting these guys in when they're as young and inexperienced as they are at these big clubs, some of them will work out, probably the majority of them won't. And ultimately, these clubs operate on a bottom line where success is more important. So, you have to win things. It's not just about money, but also winning stuff is about money, isn't it? Because it affords you the opportunity to go into the Champions League and make more money. The more palatable your football product is, the more likely you are to get on television and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it's not just criticism from fans and journalists. I think clubs are prepared to gamble, but I think there's always going to be a place for the sort of the Carlo Ancelottis of this world who have been there, done that in numerous leagues with numerous different squads.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. But if we want to truly understand this topic, we need to talk to someone who is both an elite footballer and someone who understands managers. I decided to speak with Les Ferdinand, who is the director of football for QPR and who is an elite player for Tottenham, QPR, and Newcastle, amongst others. So in recent years, we've seen Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and others get big jobs with limited coaching experience. Does that surprise you?
To a degree, I suppose. When I was going through my coaching badges, and it has to be said that to be fair to Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, he's had various different coaching jobs at senior level, albeit I think he had a short spell in this country. Was it Cardiff?
Yeah.
And he's kind of like been abroad, gaining some coaching experience. So he's had quite a few years of coaching experience. I mean, if you look at Steven Gerrard and you look at Frank Lampard. I think Steven did a couple of years in the Liverpool under-18s, and Frank got a very good job at Derby to start, and has gone on to take the Chelsea job. So yeah, I suppose in terms of those two, Gerrard getting the Rangers job and Frank getting the Chelsea job, you'd say yes. But when I was doing my coaching badges, I always remember that the tutors saying that some of you would get a job based on your reputation as a player, and some of you will have to go through the route of doing your coaching badges. And I think when you look at Steven and Frank and even Ollie, they all had great careers. And you knew those kind of opportunities were going to be available for them if they decided to go into these coaching roles that they've gone into.
Obviously your career was a bit before theirs. Do you feel like you had those same opportunities that they did?
No, I don't think I would have had the same opportunities, or I did have the same opportunities as those guys, because I was never seen as someone who would make a good manager. It's really funny because someone put this out and sent it to me, and you often get when a player comes to the end of his career and he's been associated with a football club, when the management job becomes available, loads of people are cited for that job, including some of the ex-players that have played for that football club. The Newcastle job will come up, and Alan Shearer and certain other players will be mentioned as possible candidates for the manager's job. Tottenham job will come up, and certain managers' names and certain ex-players' names will be mentioned for that job. But you will see that none of the black players are ever mentioned for any of those jobs. When you look down the list of all the people that get mentioned for that job, there's never ever a black player that has been successful at that football club ever mentioned as one of the people that will go should be considered for the manager's job.
You were an elite player. Do you think that prepared you to be, a good manager? Do you think that a playing career prepares you to be a great manager?
I think it helps. It can help, and I think we've seen in the past where not all great players become great managers. And sometimes I think from a great player sort of like a manager thing, some of the great managers who haven't played have had to work extra hard to overcome obstacles to become good managers, whereas perhaps great players automatically think they'll become great managers and perhaps don't work as hard at it as the managers that haven't played at that elite level. Does it prepare you? I think what prepares you is if you prepare yourself in the right ways to become that manager. And I think the experiences that you go through as a player, certainly through my career, I've played, I managed to play under some great managers, and you learn different things from different managers. And at times, I think that's the experiences that you take into management with you. And you look at how certain managers who've been successful and you've been under their tutelage, that you look at and think, well, those are some of the things I will take into management with me.
What do you think are some of the different qualities that it takes to be a great manager compared to being a great player? What are the differences?
I think as a player, you're pretty selfish about what you do. You have to prepare yourself and make sure that you're right. Yes, you're playing in a team organisation and a team function, but your role in the team is pretty specific in that you have to make sure that you're at the peak of your performances, and you train and you go home and you prepare yourself in the ways that's going to get the best out of yourself. When you become a manager, you're taking care of everybody else in that team, and it's not just about yourself. It's man management. It's being able to get the best out of the people that you've got around you. And I'm not just talking about the players, I'm talking about the staff you have around you and holistically the whole football club.
So man management is like kind of what you're driving at.
Yeah, man management is a key to getting the best out of everybody. And, you're going to have your ways and your ideas of how that works. And it's how you put that across and manage to get the best out of the people that you've got around you.
You had a coaching career at Tottenham for a while, but ultimately chose kind of the director of football route. Why did you leave coaching behind?
Because I didn't feel I was going to get an opportunity as a manager. And when I looked at some of my peers, i.e. the likes of Paul Ince and people like that who were desperate to be managers, most people I'd spoken to had said to me, you need to give yourself a chance. If you go into management, you need to go in somewhere where you're going to get an opportunity to do what you need to do. And I just kept looking around and looking at the opportunities that were going to be available to me, and I didn't think they were going to be fruitful. So I had to look at other avenues inside of the game, because I love and enjoy the game of football. I enjoyed and loved playing it, and I wanted to be part of it when I finished playing. And so I had to look at other avenues, because I didn't think the management route was going to be one where I'd get a job that I would be satisfied with.
You know, you said earlier that on your coaching course, you knew that certain people would get more opportunities than others based on their playing career. You know, do you think it's fair that some of these elite players get more job opportunities or get to leapfrog the competition when getting hired over maybe a more qualified candidate?
Do I think it's fair? I think that's just been the way football has been over the years. We keep being told that. There's a level of expectation with an elite player that I suppose people look at and think to themselves, well, look, he's got these experiences, he's well liked, he's gone through his qualifications. And yeah, a lot of situations occur for, I think, elite players where an elite player is not normally just dragged off finishes their careers and they get this opportunity. I think a lot of the times they're at football clubs who perhaps sack their manager and then they get the opportunity because they step into the role for a little bit and it goes on from there. You know, I know that's not the case for Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard because they've gone to clubs that they had no association with to start off with. But, you know, I think basically it's just based on their reputations as players and, you know, people going out and talking about them as good coaches.
Alex Stewart is a senior content strategist for The Athletic and covers tactics for Tifo football. Les Ferdinand is the director of football for QPR, and as a player, he scored more than 200 goals in his career, mainly for Tottenham, QPR, and Newcastle. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those music tracks in our episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, please sign up to our Patreon page where you'll get access to bonus episodes and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.